Julia Carter was a confident, independent woman in her mid-30s, navigating the challenges of pregnancy with grace. Her days were usually filled with activity, managing her work in community outreach programs, preparing for the arrival of her first child, and finding moments of peace in between. That evening, the air was crisp, the streets quiet, and Julia was making her way home after attending a prenatal yoga class at the community center. She carried a reusable tote bag with a few items she had picked up at a local store: water bottles, a pack of granola bars, and a small journal she planned to use to document her pregnancy journey. Dressed comfortably in leggings and a loose sweater that framed her growing belly, she looked serene, even as the weight of the day began to settle on her shoulders. The neighborhood Julia walked through was familiar, but not her own. She had taken a detour to avoid the congestion on the main roads and decided to enjoy the quiet streets lined with modest houses and street lamps casting soft halos on the pavement. It was the kind of area that seemed to hum with an understated charm, a mix of old residents who had lived there for decades and new families just starting out. Julia felt safe here, at least in theory. Her work in community advocacy had taught her that safety was often a privilege, one that wasn't equally distributed, and one she couldn't always count on. As she strolled, her thoughts drifted to her unborn child. She found herself daydreaming about the future, holding her baby for the first time, introducing them to the world, teaching them the values she held dear: kindness, resilience, and strength. Lost in thought, Julia barely noticed the faint hum of a car engine behind her. It was moving slowly, pacing her steps. When she finally registered the sound, she glanced over her shoulder to see a police cruiser creeping along the curb. She instinctively quickened her pace, though she told herself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. Inside the cruiser sat Officer Derek Harper, a man whose presence alone seemed to darken the already dim street. Harper was in his late 40s, a veteran on the force, though his career had never soared the way he once envisioned. He was a man shaped by bitterness, frustrated with his stalled advancement, and increasingly disconnected from the community he was supposed to serve. His face, lined with years of resentment, was set in a perpetual scowl as he watched Julia through the windshield. To him, her presence on this street at this hour was an anomaly, something that didn't fit into the narrow framework of his assumptions about who belonged and who didn't. It didn't matter that she carried nothing but a tote bag or that her posture exuded calm. Harper had already made up his mind she was suspicious. The longer Harper watched her, the more his irritation grew. It wasn't just Julia, it was everything she represented to him. In his mind, she was another example of someone who didn't belong, another face he could project his frustrations onto. He didn't consider why she might be there, or even if she had a reason to be, he didn't care. What he cared about was asserting his authority, proving to himself and anyone who might be watching that he still had control over something, even if it was just the life of a stranger. Julia noticed the car stopping just a few feet ahead of her. Harper stepped out, the weight of his boots on the pavement cutting through the stillness of the evening. She didn't stop walking, but her heartbeat quickened. She had learned long ago how to navigate encounters like this, especially as a black woman. Her father had drilled the lessons into her when she was young. Stay calm, don't make sudden movements, keep your hands visible, and never, ever show anger. She hated that these precautions were necessary, but they were ingrained in her now, as much a part of her as the blood coursing through her veins. "Hey, you!" Harper's voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet like a blade. Julia turned her head slightly, her expression neutral but polite. "Yes, officer," she replied, her tone steady. Harper was already walking toward her, his hand resting on his belt, dangerously close to the holster that held his gun. "What are you doing out here?" he demanded. There was no warmth in his voice, only suspicion. Julia stopped walking and faced him fully, clutching her tote bag a little tighter. "I'm just heading home," she said simply, hoping her calm demeanor would diffuse whatever this was. Harper stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized her. "Home? You don't live around here." It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. Julia raised an eyebrow but kept her voice measured. "I took a different route tonight. The main road is blocked. Is there a problem, officer?" She knew the script by heart, knew exactly how to phrase her words so as not to provoke him further. But Harper wasn't interested in answers. He was interested in control. "Let me see your ID," he barked, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Julia hesitated, not because she had anything to hide, but because she understood the dynamics of power in moments like these. Handing over her ID wouldn't just be an act of compliance, it would be an act of submission. And yet, she knew refusing would escalate the situation. Slowly, she reached into her tote bag and pulled out her wallet, keeping her movements deliberate. She handed him her ID, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest of moments before she stepped back. Harper studied the card, though he barely looked at the information. His judgment of her wasn't based on the details in her wallet, it was based on the color of her skin, the way she carried herself, and the assumptions he had already made. He handed the ID back with a sneer. "What's in the bag?" he asked, his eyes flicking toward her tote. Julia felt a surge of irritation but swallowed it down. "Just some snacks and a notebook," she replied. Harper didn't believe her. He stepped closer, his hand now fully resting on his gun. "Open it." Julia's heart pounded in her chest. She glanced around, realizing the street was completely empty. There was no one to witness this, no one to step in if things went wrong. She unzipped the bag and held it open, tilting it so he could see the contents. "See?" she said, her voice strained but controlled. "Nothing suspicious." Harper didn't respond. He stared at her, his jaw clenched, as though her compliance was an affront to him. He wanted her to fight back, to give him a reason to escalate. But she didn't. She wouldn't. Finally, Harper stepped back, though his hand remained on his weapon. "You need to move along," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Julia nodded, zipping her bag and adjusting it on her shoulder. She turned and began walking, her legs trembling beneath her. She didn't look back, didn't dare give him a reason to follow her again. But as she disappeared down the street, she could feel his eyes boring into her, a reminder that safety was never guaranteed, not even on a quiet evening walk. As Julia continued walking down the quiet, dimly lit street, she tried to calm the tension rippling through her body. Her grip on the strap of her tote bag tightened as she replayed the encounter in her mind. She hated how moments like this always left her feeling unsettled, even when nothing overtly dangerous had happened yet. It wasn't just about the confrontation. It was the underlying awareness that things could have escalated in ways she didn't even want to imagine. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus on the rhythmic sound of her footsteps, each one carrying her closer to home and away from the oppressive presence of Officer Harper. But Harper wasn't done. As Julia turned a corner, hoping the worst was behind her, the unmistakable growl of his cruiser's engine reached her ears once again. Her stomach twisted as she glanced over her shoulder and saw the patrol car creeping along the curb. He was following her. Her first instinct was to keep walking, to pretend she hadn't noticed, but her mind was already racing through the possibilities. Was he just trying to intimidate her? Or was he looking for an excuse to provoke another encounter? She kept her pace steady, her posture upright. trying to project an air of calm and control. But Harper had already decided this night wasn't over. He accelerated slightly, pulling up just ahead of her, and stepped out of the car with a deliberate slowness that sent a chill down her spine. He didn't call out to her this time. Instead, he leaned casually against the hood of the car, his eyes fixed on her like a predator watching prey. There was no mistaking the challenge in his posture. He wanted her to approach, to engage. Julia hesitated. Every instinct told her to avoid him, to walk past without acknowledging him, but she knew how dangerous that could be. Ignoring a man like Harper might only inflame whatever sense of power he thought he had over her. Reluctantly, she stopped a few feet away and met his gaze, her voice as steady as she could manage. "Is there something else, officer?" Harper didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. His eyes were cold, devoid of the professional detachment that should have been there. He looked at her like she was a problem he needed to solve, not a person he was supposed to protect. "What are you hiding?" he asked, his tone low and accusatory. Julia blinked, startled by the question. "I'm not hiding anything," she said, her voice firm but careful. "You already checked my ID. I showed you what was in my bag. There's nothing else to discuss." Harper smirked, a cruel twist of his lips that made her skin crawl. "See, that's the thing. People like you always have something to hide. You think you can walk around like you own the place, but I see through it. I know your type." Her chest tightened at his words. She wanted to ask him what exactly he thought her type was, but she knew better. Confronting him head-on would only escalate the situation. "I'm just trying to get home," she said instead, her tone measured. "If there's no reason for me to stay here, I'd like to keep going." But Harper wasn't interested in letting her go. He took another step closer, his hand resting on the baton at his side. "You're not going anywhere until I say so," he said, his voice dripping with authority. "Turn out your pockets." Julia froze. Her hands instinctively went to her sides, where the loose fabric of her sweater covered the pockets of her leggings. "I don't have anything in my pockets," she said slowly. "I already showed you everything in my bag." "Then it shouldn't be a problem to show me again," he snapped, his voice rising slightly. The sudden shift in his tone sent a jolt of fear through her, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she took a small step back, putting just a little more distance between them. "I've done nothing wrong," she said evenly. "And unless you have a reason to suspect me of a crime, I don't think you have the right to keep harassing me like this." Harper's face darkened. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone like her. "Don't you dare use that word with me," he snarled. "I'm doing my job, and if you have nothing to hide, then you'll cooperate. Or maybe you'd rather come down to the station and explain yourself there." Julia's heart was pounding now, but she forced herself to remain calm. She knew what he was doing, trying to bait her, to push her into saying or doing something he could use against her. "Officer," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I've been nothing but respectful. I haven't broken any laws. Please, let me go home." But Harper wasn't listening. He stepped forward again, closing the gap she'd tried to create. Before she could react, he reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip tight and unyielding. "I said turn out your pockets," he barked, yanking her closer. The sudden movement made her gasp, not just from the force of his grip, but from the way his actions jarred her already sensitive body. The weight of her pregnancy made it harder to keep her balance, and she stumbled slightly, her other hand instinctively going to her belly. "Let go of me," she said, her voice sharp with panic. "You're hurting me." But Harper didn't release her. If anything, his grip tightened, and he pulled her closer, his face just inches from hers. "Oh, don't tell me what to do," he growled. "I'll decide when this is over." Julia's mind raced. She felt trapped, like an animal cornered by a predator. Her free hand clutched the strap of her tote bag, more out of instinct than anything else. The pain in her arm was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the surge of fear coursing through her veins. She knew she had to stay calm, had to think clearly, but it was becoming harder with each passing second. And then, without warning, Harper's knee came up, striking her in the abdomen with brutal force. The impact sent a shockwave of pain through her body, and she cried out, doubling over as her legs buckled beneath her. She hit the ground hard, her hands instinctively going to her stomach, as a searing pain radiated through her core. For a moment, everything else faded away. The world around her blurred, and all she could focus on was the pain and the terrifying thought that something might be wrong with her baby. She could hear Harper's voice, distant and distorted, as he barked something she couldn't make out. She felt the cold pavement beneath her, the weight of her own body pressing down on her stomach, and the overwhelming urge to cry out for help. But there was no one else around, no one to stop him, no one to intervene. Harper loomed over her, his shadow stretching across her trembling form. "I told you to cooperate," he said, his tone cold and unrepentant. "Now look what you made me do." Julia's breath came in short, shallow gasps as she tried to push herself up, her hands still cradling her stomach. You need to call an ambulance," she managed to say, her voice weak but determined. "I'm pregnant. You hurt me." Harper's expression flickered for just a moment, something almost like doubt crossing his features, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Don't play games with me," he snapped. "You think I'm going to fall for that?" Julia stared up at him, her vision swimming. The pain was unbearable, but she forced herself to meet his gaze, her eyes blazing with defiance, even as tears streamed down her cheeks. "If anything happens to my baby," she said, her voice trembling but resolute, "you'll regret this for the rest of your life." For the first time, Harper hesitated. He glanced around, as if suddenly aware of how alone they were, how exposed he might be if someone happened upon the scene. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, his jaw tightening as he stepped back and crossed his arms. "Stay there," he said, his tone cold. "I'll decide what happens next." Julia didn't respond. She couldn't. The pain was too much, and her focus was now entirely on the life growing inside her. She closed her eyes, whispering a silent prayer that help would come, that anyone would find her before it was too late. Julia lay on the cold pavement, clutching her belly as waves of pain surged through her body. Her mind was a blur of fear and anger, but beneath it all was an unshakable determination to protect the life growing inside her. The night was eerily quiet now, the only sounds her ragged breaths and the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Harper stood over her, his posture tense and rigid, as if unsure of what to do next. For all his bravado, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, a crack in the mask of authority he had so arrogantly wielded. "You need to call an ambulance," Julia repeated, her voice weak but resolute. She tried to sit up, but the pain in her abdomen was unbearable, and she collapsed back onto the ground. "I'm pregnant. You've hurt me." Harper stared at her, his jaw clenched. For a moment it seemed like he might actually listen, but then he shook his head, as if shaking off the weight of her words. "Get up," he barked, his voice harsher than ever. "Stop playing games. You're fine." Julia glared at him through the tears clouding her vision. "I'm not fine," she shouted, her voice trembling with a mixture of pain and rage. "You kicked me. You assaulted me. And now you're refusing to help. Do you even understand what you've done?" Harper's face darkened, his features hardening into a mask of defiance. "Don't talk to me like that," he growled. You don't get to make demands here. I'm the one in charge, not you. You're in charge of nothing, Julia shot back, summoning every ounce of strength she had left. You've lost control. Look at yourself. You're a disgrace. Her words cut deeper than she expected. Harper flinched, his eyes narrowing as his fists clenched at his sides. He took a threatening step toward her, his boots scraping against the pavement. For a moment, Julia thought he might strike her again, but before he could, a voice rang out from the darkness. "Hey, what the hell is going on here?" Harper froze, his head snapping up to see a figure approaching from the other end of the street. It was an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, with a weathered face and a cane in hand. He moved with a slight limp, but there was a fire in his eyes that made him seem far from frail. He wore a thick jacket and a knit cap, and his breath puffed out invisible clouds in the chilly night air. The man stopped a few feet away, his gaze shifting from Harper to Julia, who was still lying on the ground, clutching her stomach. "Is she hurt?" he demanded, his voice laced with concern. "What did you do to her?" "Stay out of this," Harper snapped, his voice sharp and defensive. "This doesn't concern you." "The hell it doesn't." The man shot back, his cane tapping the pavement as he stepped closer. "I saw you. You were yelling at her, and now she's on the ground in pain. You think I'm just going to walk away from that?" Julia looked up at the man, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and desperation. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I need help. He won't call an ambulance." The man's expression darkened, and he turned his full attention to Harper. "Is that true?" he demanded. "You're refusing to help her?" Harper bristled, his hand instinctively going to the baton on his belt. "Back off," he warned. "This is official police business. If you interfere, I'll have no choice but to arrest you." The older man laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Arrest me? For what?" "For caring about someone who's clearly in distress. You've already crossed a line, officer. You think adding another abuse of power to the list is going to help you?" Harper's face flushed with anger. I said, "Back off." The man didn't move. Instead, he planted his cane firmly on the ground and squared his shoulders. "You listen to me," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "You might have that badge, but it doesn't give you the right to treat people like this. She's pregnant, for God's sake. Do you even realize what you've done?" Harper opened his mouth to retort, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time, doubt flickered across his face. He glanced down at Julia, who was watching the exchange with a mixture of fear and defiance, and then back at the older man. The weight of the situation was starting to press down on him, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. Not yet. "This is none of your business," he said finally, his voice quieter but no less stubborn. "Just walk away." The man shook his head again, his gaze unwavering. "No, not this time. I've seen too many people like you get away with things like this, and I'm not going to stand by and let it happen again." Julia's breath hitched as another wave of pain surged through her. She closed her eyes, fighting back tears, and forced herself to speak. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "I just need an ambulance. That's all I'm asking for." The older man nodded, his resolve hardening. "You hear that, officer? She's asking for help. Now, are you going to do your damn job, or do I have to call it in myself?" Harper's face twisted in frustration. He looked like he was on the verge of snapping, but before he could respond, the sound of tires screeching to a halt echoed down the street. All three of them turned toward the source of the noise, and Julia's heart skipped a beat when she saw a sleek black SUV pull up to the curb. The driver's side door opened, and a tall, imposing man stepped out. He was dressed in a dark suit and moved with a purposeful grace that made it clear he was not someone to be trifled with. His sharp features were set in a mask of calm, but his eyes burned with intensity as they locked onto Julia. It was Mark Carter, her husband. "Julia," he called out, his voice steady but filled with urgency. He crossed the distance between them in a few long strides and knelt beside her, his hand gently brushing her cheek. "Are you okay? What happened?" Julia let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her like a wave. "Mark," she whispered, her voice breaking. He kicked me. I think something's wrong." Mark's jaw tightened, and his eyes flicked up to Harper, who was now standing frozen a few feet away. The older man with the cane stepped back slightly, sensing that the dynamic had just shifted in a significant way. "You kicked her?" Mark's voice was calm, almost eerily so, but there was a dangerous edge to it that made Harper take an involuntary step back. "You assaulted my wife? While she's pregnant?" Harper's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She was resisting, he stammered. "I had to." "You had to," Mark interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "You had to attack an unarmed, pregnant woman. Is that the excuse you're going with?" Harper's face flushed red, and he glanced around as if looking for an escape route. "Look," he said, his tone defensive. "You don't understand. She was acting suspicious." Mark stood slowly, his full height towering over Harper, and took a deliberate step forward. "What I understand," he said, his voice low and menacing, "is that you've made a mistake. A very big mistake." Harper swallowed hard, his hand twitching toward his baton again, but Mark didn't flinch. He took another step closer, closing the gap between them, and lowered his voice even further. "You think you can do whatever you want because you've got a badge. You think you're untouchable. But let me tell you something, there are consequences for men like you. And tonight you're going to learn that the hard way." The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Harper's bravado was crumbling, and for the first time, Julia saw real fear in his eyes. He glanced at the older man, who was watching the scene with a grim satisfaction, and then back at Mark, whose unwavering gaze felt like it could pierce through steel. Mark turned back to Julia, his expression softening as he knelt beside her once more. "I've got you," he murmured, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Help is on the way." Julia managed a weak nod, her eyes glistening with tears. She didn't know how this would end, but for the first time that night, she felt a glimmer of hope. Mark Carter's gaze shifted from his wife to Officer Harper, the calm determination in his expression chilling in its intensity. Harper stood frozen, gripping his baton tightly as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. The smug authority he had wielded earlier was gone, replaced by a mixture of panic and confusion. He had expected Julia to be alone, helpless, a woman with no power to challenge him. But now, with Mark standing before him, composed and confident despite the gravity of the situation, Harper began to realize just how deeply he had underestimated the situation. Julia lay on the ground, her breathing shallow and her hands still protectively clutching her stomach. Mark knelt beside her again, his voice low and soothing as he reassured her. "The ambulance is on its way," he murmured, brushing a gentle hand over her forehead. "I called my team as soon as I got the signal from your phone. We're going to get you and the baby checked out, and I'm going to make sure this man pays for what he's done." She nodded weakly, her trust in him absolute. Despite the pain, she felt the weight of her fear begin to lift. Mark had always been a man of action, someone who could navigate even the most chaotic situations with precision and control. She had no doubt that he would see this through. Mark straightened, his posture radiating authority, and turned his full attention back to Harper. "Step back," he said, his tone firm and brooking no argument. "You've done enough." Harper hesitated, his hand twitching nervously near his holster. "Look," I was just doing my job, he stammered, trying to sound authoritative but failing miserably. She was acting suspicious. I had reason to believe. You had no reason, Mark interrupted, his voice sharp and cutting. You attacked a pregnant woman without cause, and now you're scrambling to justify it. You think your badge makes you untouchable? Let me assure you it doesn't. The older man with the cane, who had been watching the exchange from a few steps away, chuckled dryly. I told you, he said, addressing Harper with a shake of his head. You messed with the wrong people tonight. Harper glared at him, but the fear in his eyes betrayed his growing uncertainty. I don't need to explain myself to you, he snapped, though his voice lacked the conviction it had held earlier. I'll handle this the way I see fit. Mark took a deliberate step closer, his towering presence forcing Harper to take a step back. You're not handling anything, Mark said coldly. From this moment on, you're done. Your authority ends here. Before Harper could respond, the sound of approaching engines broke the tense silence. 3 black SUVs pulled up to the curb, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. The vehicles were unmarked, but the precision with which they parked and the speed with which the occupants exited made it clear that they were not ordinary bystanders. 5 men and women, all dressed in dark tactical gear, emerged and moved toward Mark with practiced efficiency. One of them, a tall man with a headset and a no-nonsense demeanor, approached Mark and gave him a quick nod. We're here, sir, he said. What's the situation? Mark gestured toward Julia without taking his eyes off Harper. My wife needs immediate medical attention, he said. An ambulance is on its way, but I want her escorted to the hospital and monitored until I can join her. She's in pain, and I don't want to take any chances. The man nodded again and motioned for 2 of his team members to assist Julia. They moved quickly but gently, speaking to her in calm, reassuring tones as they assessed her condition and prepared to transport her to one of the SUVs. Harper watched the scene unfold with growing unease. What is this? He demanded, his voice rising. Who are these people? What the hell is going on? Mark finally turned to him fully, his expression unreadable. You assaulted my wife, he said, his voice low and even. And in doing so, you made this personal. But you also made a mistake far larger than you realize. You see, I'm not just her husband. I'm someone who has the resources and the authority to hold people like you accountable. Harper's face paled. You're bluffing, he said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his doubt. You think you can just show up here with a bunch of people in black uniforms and scare me? I'm the law here. You don't intimidate me. Mark's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. You're right about one thing, he said. I'm not here to intimidate you. I'm here to ensure that justice is served. As he spoke, one of the team members handed Mark a tablet. He tapped the screen a few times, and a live video feed appeared, showing the dashboard camera footage from Harper's cruiser. The timestamp on the video aligned perfectly with the events of the night, capturing Harper's aggressive approach, his threats, and, most damningly, the moment he struck Julia. The footage was clear and undeniable. Mark held the tablet up for Harper to see. This is your work, isn't it? He asked, his tone almost conversational. Your own dashcam captured everything. There's no ambiguity. No room for interpretation. You attacked an unarmed, pregnant woman. That's the only story this video tells. Harper's mouth opened, but no words came out. His mind raced as he tried to come up with an explanation, an excuse, anything that could save him, but the evidence was irrefutable. He looked around desperately, hoping to find an ally, but the older man with the cane simply shook his head in disgust, and the tactical team stood impassively, awaiting further instructions. You're done, Mark said simply, lowering the tablet. You're going to be arrested, and this video will ensure that you face the consequences of your actions. There's no way out for you. Harper's bravado crumbled completely. His shoulders slumped, and his hand fell away from his baton. "This isn't fair," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I was just doing my job." "Your job," Mark repeated, his voice tinged with incredulity. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to abuse and terrorize. You failed, Officer Harper. You failed on every level." The sound of approaching sirens signaled the arrival of the ambulance, as well as several marked police cars. The tactical team stepped aside as paramedics rushed to Julia's side, loading her carefully onto a stretcher and into the ambulance. Mark bent down to kiss her forehead before she was taken away, whispering something only she could hear. She nodded weakly, her eyes filled with trust, and the ambulance sped off into the night. The police officers who had arrived on the scene hesitated as they took in the sight of the tactical team and the subdued Harper. One of them, a younger officer with a hesitant expression, approached Mark. "Sir," he began, glancing nervously at Harper, "what's going on here?" Mark handed him the tablet, the video still playing. "What's going on?" he said, his tone sharp, "is that your colleague assaulted my wife. The evidence is right there. I suggest you take him into custody before this situation escalates any further." The younger officer watched the video, his face growing more troubled with each passing second. Finally, he nodded and motioned to his partner. Together they approached Harper and placed him in handcuffs. Harper didn't resist, his head hanging low as they led him to a squad car. Mark watched in silence, his expression unreadable as the car pulled away. He turned to the tactical team leader and nodded. "Thank you for your quick response," he said. "I'll handle the rest from here." The leader nodded. "We're at your disposal, sir. Just say the word." Mark's gaze lingered on the empty street for a moment, the weight of the night settling heavily on his shoulders. But then he straightened, his resolve hardening. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Harper's actions were part of a larger problem, one that Mark was determined to confront head-on. And he wouldn't stop until justice was served not just for Julia, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by the abuse of power. With that thought, he climbed into one of the SUVs and headed toward the hospital, ready to stand by his wife's side and continue the fight. Mark arrived at the hospital minutes after the ambulance carrying Julia. His mind raced with emotions, anger, worry, and an unrelenting need to ensure justice. He strode through the hospital doors, his sharp suit and focused demeanor cutting through the sterile chaos of the emergency room. Nurses and staff glanced at him, sensing the urgency and authority radiating from his presence. Mark's tactical team remained outside, monitoring the scene and awaiting further instructions, ensuring no interference from anyone connected to Officer Harper or his precinct. A nurse approached him quickly. "Are you Mr. Carter? Your wife is stable, but the doctor is still assessing her condition and the baby's health. She's being taken to a private room for observation." Mark exhaled sharply, his fists unclenching slightly as relief mixed with the simmering fury inside him. "Thank you," he said, his voice clipped but polite. "Please let me know the moment I can see her." As the nurse nodded and walked away, Mark pulled out his phone. He knew this wasn't the time to simply wait. Harper's actions tonight had revealed more than just personal malice. It exposed a systemic rot that Mark had long suspected existed in the precinct. Harper wasn't acting alone. His arrogance and recklessness spoke of a man who felt protected, emboldened by a culture that rewarded abuse of power. Mark had dealt with men like him before, and he knew they were rarely isolated actors. This was bigger than Harper, and Mark intended to expose the entire web. He placed a call to one of his closest allies, an investigative journalist named Dana Hayes. Dana had worked with Mark on previous cases involving police corruption and had proven to be not only fearless but thorough. When she answered, Mark's tone was direct. "Dana, I need you to dig into the files I sent you last month, specifically on the precinct Harper is part of. I believe tonight confirms what we suspected. I'll forward you additional evidence soon, but I need you ready to blow this wide open." "Understood," Dana replied. Her voice was steady, but Mark could sense the spark of determination in her tone. "I'll get started immediately. Keep me updated." Mark ended the call just as one of his tactical team members entered the waiting room, walking with purpose. "Sir, we've accessed the records from Harper's bodycam and communication logs. You were right, there's a trail. He's not working alone." Mark's jaw tightened. "Go on." The team member handed Mark a tablet. On the screen were records showing a series of text messages and calls between Harper and two other officers in his precinct men Mark had already flagged in his investigation. The messages revealed a pattern of targeting individuals like Julia, fabricating justifications for stops and arrests, and sharing resources to cover up excessive force complaints. It wasn't just malice, it was organized, deliberate, and systemic. They've been sharing tips on how to manipulate reports and avoid accountability, the team member continued. Harper's communication tonight included a call to one of those officers right after he left his cruiser. It's likely he was planning to coordinate his story in case there were any complaints. Mark's grip on the tablet tightened, his mind racing with the implications. This is more than just rogue behavior. This is a network. These men think they're untouchable. The team member nodded. And they've been operating this way for years. Harper's records alone are damning, but if we dig deeper, we'll find more. Mark's eyes burned with cold fury. "Good, keep digging. I want every piece of evidence we can find, every message, every report, every case they've manipulated. And I want it done discreetly. We're not giving them the chance to cover their tracks." The team member nodded and left to continue the work. Mark's focus shifted back to Julia. The nurse returned moments later, leading him to her private room. Julia lay in the bed, pale but alert, her hand resting protectively on her belly. The sight of her like this, vulnerable but strong, filled Mark with both anger and resolve. He approached her, his expression softening as he sat beside her. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently. Julia managed a faint smile. "Better now that you're here. The doctor says the baby seems okay, but they're monitoring me just to be sure." Mark exhaled in relief and took her hand in his. "I'll make sure you're safe, Julia. And I'll make sure Harper and everyone like him pays for what they've done." Julia's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet determination. "This isn't just about me, Mark. There are so many others people who didn't have someone like you to fight for them. We can't just stop with Harper." Mark nodded. "We won't. I promise you, this is only the beginning." As they spoke, one of the tactical team members entered the room. "Sir, there's been a development. Harper's precinct is moving quickly. They've already submitted a preliminary report claiming tonight's events were a standard interaction that escalated because of resistance from the suspect." Mark's eyes narrowed, his anger reigniting. "They're trying to bury it before it gains traction." The team member nodded. "It gets worse. The two officers Harper contacted earlier have already begun altering their records to back up his version of events. They're circling the wagons." Mark stood, his presence commanding. "Then we'll strike before they can lock those wagons. I want all the altered records flagged, the original files preserved, and every inconsistency highlighted. Send everything to Dana Hayes. We're taking this public before they can spin their lies." As the team member left to carry out the orders, Mark turned back to Julia. "They think they can silence us," he said, his voice steady but fierce. "But they don't know who they're dealing with." Julia squeezed his hand. "Make them regret underestimating us." Minutes later, Mark was back in the waiting room, coordinating with his team as the investigation expanded. The evidence against Harper and his network was mounting, and Mark knew they were on the brink of uncovering something massive. But he also knew they were racing against time. The longer the precinct had to cover their tracks, the harder it would be to hold them accountable. Then came the call he'd been waiting for. Dana's voice crackled through the line, sharp and energized. "Mark, this is bigger than we thought. I've found a connection between Harper's precinct and a private security contractor that's been funding their operations. It looks like they've been incentivizing aggressive policing tactics in certain neighborhoods to create demand for their services." Mark's mind clicked into high gear. "Corporate funding for police corruption," he said, his tone grim. "That explains the confidence, the resources, the coordination. They're not just acting on their own, they're being enabled." Dana's voice was resolute. "This story isn't just about one bad precinct anymore. It's about exposing an entire system." Mark nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Keep digging. I'll send you everything else we uncover. We need to build an airtight case before we go public." As the call ended, Mark felt the weight of the night pressing on him, but it didn't slow him down. If anything, it fueled his determination. He returned to Julia's room, taking a moment to sit beside her and hold her hand. The fight was far from over, but together they would see it through. By the time the first rays of dawn began to break over the horizon, the pieces were falling into place. The evidence was overwhelming, the connections undeniable. Harper and his network had operated in the shadows for too long, but now the light was shining on them, and there was nowhere left to hide. Mark knew the battle ahead would be fierce, but he also knew they were ready. Justice wasn't just a possibility, it was inevitable. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the doors opened, and Mark Carter strode in with an air of unshakable confidence. He was flanked by Dana Hayes and several members of his investigative team, each carrying carefully organized files that contained the damning evidence against Officer Derek Harper and the corrupt network that had shielded him. Every step Mark took echoed through the packed room, a reminder to everyone present that this was no ordinary trial. This was a reckoning. Julia sat in the front row, her presence a quiet but powerful statement. Though still recovering, she insisted on attending, determined to see this through to the end. Her posture was upright, her expression calm yet resolute. Mark had tried to dissuade her, worried about the toll it might take on her, but Julia had silenced his concerns with a simple sentence: "This isn't just for me, it's for everyone who's suffered like I have." Her determination only fueled Mark's resolve. At the defendant's table sat Harper, his once cocky demeanor replaced by a pale, tight-lipped expression. His attorney, a high-priced lawyer provided by the police union, whispered urgently to him, but Harper barely seemed to register the words. He was a man who had spent his career projecting power and control, yet now he looked like a cornered animal, trapped by forces far beyond his comprehension. The weight of the evidence against him was crushing, and he knew it. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. What followed was a methodical dismantling of Harper's defense. Mark, serving as the lead counsel for the prosecution, began by presenting the dashboard camera footage. The video played on a large screen, and the courtroom watched in silence as Harper's aggressive behavior unfolded. His hostile demands, the unwarranted search, and finally the brutal kick to Julia's abdomen, it was all there, clear and undeniable. Gasps rippled through the audience as the footage ended, leaving no doubt in anyone's mind about Harper's guilt. Mark turned to the jury, his voice steady and measured. This is not an isolated incident. This is not a momentary lapse in judgment. What you've just witnessed is part of a pattern of abuse, enabled by a system that prioritizes power over accountability. He then began to lay out the broader conspiracy. Using evidence uncovered by his team and Dana's investigative reporting, Mark connected the dots between Harper, his colleagues, and the private security contractor that had been funding their operations. He showed how the contractor had incentivized aggressive policing in targeted neighborhoods, creating a cycle of fear and mistrust that allowed them to profit from increased demand for their services. Financial records, internal emails, and whistleblower testimony painted a damning picture of systemic corruption. Harper's attorney tried to object, claiming that the evidence was irrelevant to the specific charges against his client, but the judge overruled him. Mark pressed on, his momentum unstoppable. "This is not just about Officer Harper," he said, his voice rising with controlled passion. "This is about a system that rewards brutality and punishes accountability. Harper may have acted with his own hands, but he was empowered by those who turned a blind eye, those who encouraged this behavior for their own gain." The climax of Mark's case came when he called Julia to the stand. The room held its breath as she rose and approached the witness stand, her every step a testament to her courage. Mark's questions were gentle but precise, guiding her through the events of that night. Julia spoke with a quiet strength, recounting how Harper had escalated the situation, how he had refused to listen to her, and how his actions had endangered not only her life, but the life of her unborn child. "I begged him to stop," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "I told him I was pregnant. I told him he was hurting me. And he looked me in the eyes and didn't care. That's what's most terrifying, he didn't care." Harper's attorney attempted to cross-examine, but Julia's calm, factual responses left him floundering. She refused to be rattled, her strength shining through every word. By the time she stepped down from the stand, there was no doubt in anyone's mind about the truth of her testimony. The final blow to Harper's defense came when Mark called one of Harper's former colleagues to the stand. This officer, who had worked closely with Harper before deciding to come forward as a whistleblower, testified about the culture within their precinct. He spoke of how officers were encouraged to establish dominance during interactions, particularly with minorities, and how complaints against them were routinely buried by their superiors. "I regret not speaking up sooner," the whistleblower admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "But when I saw what happened to Julia Carter, I couldn't stay silent anymore. What happened to her wasn't just wrong, it was criminal." By the time Mark delivered his closing argument, the jury was visibly moved. "We cannot allow men like Derek Harper to continue wearing the badge," Mark said, his voice ringing through the courtroom. "We cannot allow a system that enables such behavior to go unchecked. Today, you have the power to send a message not just to Harper, but to everyone who thinks they are above the law. Justice isn't just an abstract concept. It's action. It's accountability. It's this moment." The jury deliberated for hours, but when they returned, their verdict was clear: guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and applause. Though Mark remained composed, his focus still on Julia. He knew this victory was just one step in a much larger fight. As Harper was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of defeat, Mark turned to Julia and took her hand. "It's over," he said softly. Julia shook her head. "No," she replied, her voice filled with quiet determination. "This part is over. But there's still so much more to do." Mark nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Together they had faced one of the darkest nights of their lives and emerged stronger. But their fight for justice for a world where no one would have to endure what Julia had was far from finished. This was just the beginning. The courtroom victory marked a pivotal moment, but for Mark and Julia Carter, it was not the end of their journey. The days that followed Harper's conviction were filled with a whirlwind of media attention, community outreach, and behind-the-scenes work to dismantle the toxic structures that had enabled Harper and others like him. For Julia, the focus was on healing not just her body, which still bore the aches and strains from that night, but her spirit. For Mark, it was a matter of channeling his righteous anger into lasting change, ensuring that the systems responsible for his wife's suffering could no longer operate unchecked. As Julia rested at home, she spent her days preparing for the arrival of their baby. Her movements were slower now, but her resolve was unwavering. She refused to let that night define her or cast a shadow over the joy of becoming a mother. Instead, she used it as motivation to speak out. Within weeks, she had begun appearing at community events, addressing crowds with a quiet but powerful voice. Her speeches weren't filled with fire or rhetoric they didn't need to be. Her presence alone was enough to inspire. Julia spoke of her experience not as a victim, but as a survivor. She refused to let anyone else speak for her, ensuring her story was told on her terms. Mark, meanwhile, was relentless in his pursuit of accountability. With the help of Dana Hayes and his investigative team, he continued to uncover deeper layers of corruption within the precinct and its ties to the private security contractor. The evidence they unearthed was staggering: decades of misconduct buried under falsified reports, connections to corporate interests that benefited from over-policing, and a network of officers who had operated with near-total impunity. The more they uncovered, the more resistance they faced. Mark found himself the target of smear campaigns, false accusations, and even thinly veiled threats. But he was undeterred. Every attack only solidified his resolve. He knew that the fight wasn't just about Harper, it was about dismantling the entire system that had allowed someone like him to thrive. It wasn't long before the momentum of their work began to ripple outward. Harper's conviction sparked renewed interest in other cases of police misconduct, with activists and journalists across the country using the Carters' case as a rallying cry. Mark's legal team began receiving calls from families who had lost loved ones to police violence, each story a heartbreaking reminder of the work still left to do. Together, Mark and Julia decided to establish the Carter Foundation, an organization dedicated to fighting systemic injustice. The foundation provided legal aid to victims of police misconduct, funded independent investigations, and lobbied for legislative reforms aimed at increasing transparency and accountability within law enforcement. One of their first victories came just months after Harper's sentencing. With mounting pressure from the Carter Foundation, community leaders, and national advocacy groups, the City Council passed a sweeping police reform bill. The legislation included mandatory body cameras, independent oversight for complaints, and the establishment of a civilian review board with real authority to investigate and discipline officers. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Throughout it all, Julia and Mark leaned on each other. Their bond, already strong, grew even deeper as they navigated the challenges of their new roles. Mark admired Julia's courage and resilience, while Julia found strength in Mark's unwavering dedication. Together they became a symbol of what could be achieved when personal pain was transformed into collective action. The night their baby was born was a quiet, joyful moment, a stark contrast to the chaos that had brought them to this point. Julia had insisted on a natural birth, despite the lingering trauma from Harper's assault, and Mark had been by her side every step of the way. When their daughter finally arrived, the room was filled with tears and laughter. Julia held her close, marveling at the tiny life they had fought so hard to protect. They named her Hope, a testament to the belief that even in the darkest moments, there is always the possibility of light. In the months that followed, Hope became a source of inspiration not just for Julia and Mark, but for everyone who followed their story. Pictures of Julia holding her baby at rallies and events became iconic, a symbol of resilience and the unbreakable bond between mother and child. Hope's presence was a reminder of what was at stake: a future free from fear, where justice and equality were not ideals, but realities. Despite the progress they had made, the road ahead was still long and fraught with challenges. The backlash was inevitable. Opponents of reform labeled Mark and Julia as agitators, accusing them of sowing division and undermining law enforcement. Harper's supporters, though few, were vocal, painting him as a scapegoat for a broken system. But the Carters refused to be silenced. They knew the stakes were too high to back down. One evening, as they sat together in their living room, Hope asleep in Julia's arms, Mark looked over at his wife. "Do you ever think about what life would be like if that night had never happened?" he asked softly. Julia considered the question for a moment, her gaze fixed on the sleeping baby in her arms. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I remember that even though it was one of the worst nights of our lives, it led us here. To her, to this fight. And I wouldn't trade that for anything." Mark reached over and took her free hand in his grip firm and steady. "We're going to change things," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "Not just for her, but for everyone." Julia smiled, her eyes shining with a mixture of determination and love. "We already are." The foundation continued to grow, its reach expanding far beyond the city where their journey had begun. Julia and Mark's story inspired a new wave of activism, with communities across the country demanding accountability and reform. Laws were changed, policies rewritten, and though progress was slow, it was undeniable. Years later, on the anniversary of Harper's conviction, the Carters stood together at a rally in the heart of the city. Thousands of people had gathered, their voices united in a call for justice. Julia took the stage, her hand clasped tightly around Mark's, and addressed the crowd with the same quiet strength that had carried her through that fateful night. "This isn't just our story," she said, her voice carrying over the sea of faces. "It's the story of everyone who has ever been silenced, everyone who has ever been told they don't matter. It's a story of resilience, of hope, and of the power we have when we stand together. We are not defined by what happens to us, but by how we choose to respond. And today we choose to fight, not just for ourselves, but for a future where no one has to endure what we have." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices rising in a wave of solidarity and determination. Mark looked at Julia with pride, his heart swelling as he saw the impact she had on the people around her. Together they had turned their pain into purpose, their trauma into triumph. As the rally continued, Julia and Mark stood together, their daughter Hope at their side. The three of them were a picture of strength and unity, a family bound not just by love, but by their shared commitment to justice. They knew the fight was far from over, but they also knew that they were not alone. And in that moment, surrounded by the voices of a movement they had helped ignite, they felt a profound sense of hope for the future.